probably the most down-to-earth yet intractable problem facing communities and their local government institutions in the second half of the 19th century was simply this: how to deal with the body waste generated by an ever-growing population. It was a topic that occupied huge numbers of column inches in local newspapers and fueled lively and sometimes bitter debate. In fact, as the Hampton Wick local board chairman at the time put it, next to contests about religion, there is nothing which waxes so warm as a sewage fight. And later on in the quote he says, and if the facts don't fit the cause, well, bad luck, facts will stick to it anyway. So how did such an unprepossessing issue come to force itself centre stage on the attention of so many worthy and capable local politicians? Why did it leave them struggling to find solutions for so many years, and how was it eventually resolved? Now, call me sad, but a couple of years ago I set out to chronicle the long and difficult transition from the use of these night soil men to this community sewage system. Public treatment works, and I was looking at the Society's 4 communities, Hampton, Wick, Teddington, Twickenham, and Hampton, and I was finding that behind each of these was a very interesting, yet always a different story. And in tonight's talk, entitled Down the Drain, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to recount for you one of these, how the local politicians in Hampton Wick resolved the problem. I learnt from Chris at last month's meeting that it's okay to plug your book. And so we've found as many copies as we can, and it's on offer from John. So Hampton Wick eventually created their own solution to this nationwide problem, and the narrative I'm going to give is both of dogged determination and sometimes a seemingly endless procrastination. But finally their dedication paid off, aided, as we'll see, by 2 moments of brilliant opportunism. And perhaps, like me, you'll be surprised to find that their invaluable contribution to the health and welfare of the 1800s is still operating, almost unchanged, to this day. But before I begin my story, I need to explain the context in which it is set. Now, this graph shows the growth in the population of England for the first 800 years of the last millennium. Apart from the glitch at the time of the Black Death, growth had been steady, and there was nothing to suggest what was about to happen, which is this. With such an amazing increase in the growth rate, it's clear that whatever had been done for up to 1800 was no longer going to be valid thereafter. The need to produce ever more food required radical changes in farming practices, which brought about the Enclosure Act, which greatly increased the scale of farming and brought about also the use of fertilizers and manure to improve the yield. And food imports increased significantly from 1800 onwards. However, since you came tonight for a talk entitled Down the Drain, you will know that our focus this evening is not on food, but on the other end of the digestive tract. And more tracts consuming food meant more waste emerging at the other end, and the existing sanitary provisions covering water and waste were not going to hack it. Now, a greetings card artist might have this view of a well, and it's all good and pretty. But in a place like Hampton Wick, the reality is probably more like the village pump. But whatever the way in which the water was raised from the ground, a well was basically just a hole that was sunk down to the subsurface water, and whether you brought it up by bucket or by a pump made very little difference. Now, the fourth item on this slide looks awfully like a well, but in fact it's not. What you need to focus on is the pipe in the top corner, which shows that it's not a well, it's a cesspit. And a cesspit is what goes down the drain, that's where it ends up. The liquid percolates away and the solid builds up. And what happens is our famed night soil men would come and empty your cesspit at night and take it away, and they would actually go to the local farmer and sell it to them as efficacious excrement. Now, as this map of Hampton Wick in 1831 shows, they didn't have to go very far in order to sell their product. But as the towns grew, the farms retreated, which meant that the night soil men had to take their waste much further off. They put their prices up. People chose not to pay the higher prices and decided instead just to dig another pit. And so many gardens became honeycombed with the wretched thing. But it was interesting that effectively produced a virtuous circle where the waste was being used to produce more food. So a new approach to sanitation was needed, designed to run at a community level rather than at an individual property basis. There were clear advantages in having an integrated system of sewers capable of carrying off the waste of a whole community to a plot of land where it could be treated collectively. But to implement such schemes, local authorities would need new powers to raise capital and to enforce adoption of their schemes. Parliament therefore passed a programme of enabling legislation in the mid-1800s to provide such powers locally, but its adoption was not compulsory. The traditional laissez-faire system of central government in Victorian Britain typically left it to the local communities to choose whether they wished to adopt the powers offered or to remain with the existing church-based vestry system of local administration. As we'll see, Hampton Wick was not slow in grasping the new opportunity, whilst, for example, neighbours at Hampton waited another 30 years before forming a local government board. But meanwhile, attitudes and practices were changing, driven by economic, not humanitarian considerations. Now here's a frightening statistic. When Queen Victoria came to the throne, 1/2 of London's infants lived to their 5th birthday. The economic impact of such attrition in the future workforce, and hence Britain's continuing ability to compete in world markets, became an increasing concern. As a first response, the government passed the 1837 Registration Act, and in establishing a national system for recording births, marriages and deaths, they also enabled mortality rates to be compared across the country. For the first time, the links between poverty, ill health, and the cost of both of these to the local community became firmly established. And with a growing sanitary crisis looming, the government moved to shore up its existing infrastructures. Under the 1847 Towns Improvement Clauses Act, local authorities were encouraged to build public sewers and were also given specific powers for these sewers to communicate with and empty themselves into the sea or any public river. However, many local authorities were now taking this concession to its logical conclusion and openly encouraging their population to connect private cesspools directly to the local sewer system. The effect of the new legislation was therefore to legitimise the use of rivers to rid the communities of its waste. As time went by, rivers became increasingly polluted as they flowed down to their estuaries. And this legislation would soon come back to haunt the government. Meanwhile, a different catalyst was bringing about a fundamental rethink of national sanitary strategy. There were 2 outbreaks of cholera which hit London in the 1830s and 40s, killing several thousand people. The cause of the disease was unknown, and opinions were divided as to how it was transmitted. Was it by touch? That's contagion. Or was it by smell? Miasma. It happened that the miasmatic thinking dominated official medical and government policy, and as a result, the sewer system in the metropolis was regularly flushed to get rid of the smell, and hence it was thought the risk of disease, from the houses and the streets, but at the expense of hugely polluting the Thames itself. Yet because these measures were taken in ignorance of the actual cause, cholera returned once again in the 1850s and took out another 11,000 people. In June 1858, the combination of sewer flushing and a severe and prolonged heat wave provided perfect storm conditions that would directly and swiftly lead to a radical change in central government policy. Because of the heat, the level of the Thames had dropped significantly, leaving raw sewage deposited on the foreshore. For several days it lay there, whilst temperatures in the shade averaged mid-30s centigrade, rising to 48 degrees centigrade in the sun. The effect on the accumulated sewage was so extreme that the press soon began calling the event the Great Stink. Now, the government attempted to carry on business in its newly reopened Houses of Parliament right by the river, but the stench forced MPs to retreat from some of the committee rooms which were on the riverside, and the curtains were soaked in lime chloride to try and mask the smell. But that wasn't very successful, and discussions were held about the possibility of actually moving the business of government to Oxford or St Albans. In 1858, Disraeli, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, responded to what he described as a Stygian pool reeking with ineffable and intolerable horrors. No, me neither, but it doesn't sound very pleasant, does it? So he tabled a bill that would authorise the Metropolitan Board of Works to borrow £3 million, which is now equivalent to $7.5 billion, to fix the problem. And amazingly, it received the royal assent just 18 days later. Now, it so happened that the Metropolitan Board of Works, their chief engineer, one Joseph Bazalgette, had by 1856 already completed plans for a combined system that's capable of handling both sewage and rainwater, and his system would serve the whole of the area covered by the Metropolitan Board of Works. Bazalgette's plan were based on a hierarchy of small street sewers, existing and new, which would total 13,000 miles in length, which is more than halfway around the world. Just imagine that. These in turn would feed into 6 new main intercepting sewers, 3 on each side of the river, and built at different heights to match the contours of the surrounding areas. These terminated at 2 great pumping stations at Crossness in the south and Abbey Mills on the north bank, and these would discharge the sewage at high tide so it would be carried out towards the North Sea. The intercepting sewers totaled 450 miles in length, with the lowest level sewers being hidden within massive new embankments, Chelsea and Victoria Embankment on the north side and the Albert Embankment on the south. And these works between them reclaimed 52 acres of land from the river. The works were indeed on a vast scale, and of course the network still serves the needs of central London. And as this magnificent view of Crossness pumping station shows, the design was anything but utilitarian, yet it was operational within 7 years of Disraeli's sanction of the funding. Now, having ensured that in due course the central London river would no longer be polluted by the inhabitants, it was inevitable that the government's attention would next turn to those communities upstream who still continue to use the river to carry off their sewage outfalls. And of course these included Hampton Wick. Now, I mentioned earlier that the government was enacting legislation that gave the option for communities to form a local board to take control of a wider range of their parish affairs than the previous church-based vestry system. This legislation included the ability to implement community-wide sewage schemes and, crucially, gave them the ability to access funds by borrowing against the future rates. The proposal for the formation of a board was tabled by Thomas James Nelson, a recently arrived resident of Hampton Wick, who only in his mid-30s had nevertheless been appointed solicitor to the City of London. The public meeting to discuss the proposal was held in April 1863, and Nelson used his knowledge of the law and current affairs, together with his obvious skills as an orator, to present a convincing case to his fellow parishioners. The resolution in favour of adopting the Act was passed unanimously, as was a second resolution that the board should consist of 9 members. The provisions of the Act became effective 2 months later, and the Hampton Wick Local Board held its first meeting on the 22nd of June. The meetings were reported in the Surrey Comet, and I've collected and read over 400 of these reports. A fascinating source. And from the outset, one of the board's main preoccupations was the sanitary, or rather unsanitary, state of the village. And already at their third meeting on the 3rd of August in 1863, the board commissioned its surveyor to devise a new system of drainage for the village. Preparation of these had to await the imminent publication of the first edition of the Ordnance Survey's 6-inch map, with its essential elevation measurements needed to calculate pipe gradients and trench depths. A basic system of sewers already existed in Hampton Wick, and around 40 houses were draining into the Thames. The rest used cesspits. There was as yet no supply of piped water, so everyone was dependent on well water. The main sewer served the High Street and part of Park Road, and it passed down Old Bridge Street and had an outfall in the river at a point marked with an arrow. Another smaller sewer drained the terrace, which is the houses opposite the end of Kingston Bridge, and they had their own private sewer, which again emptied at that same point. And a third open sewer, known locally as the Crown Ditch, originated in Home Park as an outlet from the Long Water. So we're here in the bottom left-hand corner of the slide, and you can see how it connects and again flows out at the foot of the bridge. And the effect of that stream over the hundreds of years that had been there was that a small bay had been scoured out by the ditch overflow. In summer, when there was little stream to carry it away, the offensive material became trapped in this bay just under the bridge toll point. Unsurprisingly, remedying this very public nuisance was a high priority for the new local board, and eventually a new covered sewer was built to relieve the Crown Ditch, and the bay itself was filled in. The new sewage scheme was ready for discussion at the March 1864 meeting, and the main proposal was to replace the old drains under the High Street and Park Road with a new brick sewer running to the existing outfall at the foot of Old Bridge Street. Now, Nelson's position in the city provided him with inside knowledge of what was going on, and he therefore advised the board that before proceeding any further, it would be best to check whether the recently founded Thames Conservators, founded under the Thames Navigation Act, would object to this scheme. This proved to be a wise precaution. The Conservators were currently in a heavy dispute with Kingston Town Council and were soon to have the power of a new law on their side, one which would forever change the drainage landscape for Hampton, Wick and all the other riparian communities along the entire length of the river. This act, passed in 1866 and extended in 1867, ruled that no new flow of sewage into the river or its tributaries was to be allowed, and all existing sewage works that used the river were to be removed. Thus, the government had performed a complete about-face on their 1847 Act, which had encouraged the use of rivers for sewage. A brief moratorium was allowed for the changes to be made, but thereafter a fine amounting to £100 a day, which is equivalent to £180,000 a day, would be levied. Losing access to the river for disposing of their sewage was probably a bigger problem for Hampton Wick than for any other riparian authority. Although at 1,300 acres it was actually bigger than its neighbour across the river in Kingston, more than 90% of these acres belonged to the Crown. And although approaches were made on several occasions, the Queen and her advisers made it abundantly clear they were not at all amused with the notion that her royal parks should host a sewage farm. And when the Thames Conservators' deadline approached, Hampton Wick requested and were granted an extension. In 1868, Thomas James Nelson became chairman of the Hampton Wick Local Board, an office he was to hold for the next 17 years until his death. His first act as chairman was to remind his colleagues that the clock was ticking on the Conservators' embargo on sewage discharge into the river. A special meeting of the board was called to allow the members to discuss the issue at length. The Surrey Comet carried a very full report of this highly animated meeting. Thomas Nelson opened by giving a very thorough and indeed very objective summary of where they were at. He then put forward his three arguments. Firstly, he urged that the board must take urgent and definite action or face being fined by the Thames Conservators. Secondly, he explained he was persuaded that they should not limit their consideration to just those 40 houses currently draining into the river. He thought the question was much more, how many other properties ought we to be providing for? And third, he insisted he was utterly convinced that they could not tackle the problem alone. Combining with Kingston seemed the obvious, if not the only, current alternative. At the same meeting, Thomas Barker declared himself unconvinced and put forward an alternative to Nelson's three arguments. He was convinced that, at least in the short term, the only thing they had to do was to stop the sewage from those 40 houses from draining into the river. So let's just solve that problem by creating a large communal cesspool in Hampton Court Road, linked to a single interceptor drain, which would collect and hold all of the drainage currently falling into the Thames. The liquid content would just percolate through the porous sides and bottom of the cesspool, which would itself be made so large that it would never need emptying. Barker argued that by implementing his scheme, they would at least satisfy the Conservators' immediate demands and buy themselves time to devise a longer-term solution. And Barker's motion that his scheme should be referred to a new drainage subcommittee was carried almost unanimously. Barker's scheme was doomed from the outset. Firstly, Hampton Court Road belonged to the Crown, who of course refused to have a cesspit sited under it. So the single large tank became two smaller ones. Then it turned out that there was underground water, so the tanks could not be porous after all, but would need to be lined, which meant that the liquid element would have to be drained off and treated separately before it was released into the river, and so on and so on. As the costs escalated, the feasibility of the scheme looked increasingly questionable, and at their meeting in February 1870, it was quietly abandoned, and the board again applied to the Conservators for an extension, which was granted up to the end of September 1871. To coincide with the new deadline, the Thames Conservators then wrote an identical letter addressed to all the riparian authorities whose sewage outfall was still connected to the board. They wrote to each one saying, "It's been reported to the Conservators of the River Thames that the sewage of Hampton, Wick, Kingston, Teddington and so on is still allowed to flow into the river. And I'm directed by them to inform you that it is their intention to take immediate proceedings against the local board of Hampton, Wick, Teddington, whatever, for disregarding the notices which they have served on that body for the discontinuation of the passage of sewage into the river, and thereby to enforce compliance with the terms of the Thames Act 1866 and 1867. The board were at a complete loss as to how to respond to this, so again they asked for a stay of execution, which was given. Now, all the authorities to whom the letter was addressed were fully mindful of their legal obligations, but were completely frustrated in their many attempts to acquire land on which to process their sewage by irrigation or filtration. Each proposal required a local government board public inquiry to be held, and at each inquiry numerous objectors would appear to explain the irreparable damage that the scheme under discussion would do to their properties and or their interests. And each time the application would end up being refused. Worse, the considerable cost of the inquiry would then have to be borne by the authorities' own ratepayers. The one germ of hope was that in 1875 the government passed another Public Health Act which further widened the scope of the local authorities' sanitary responsibilities, but also crucially provided the possibility of local authorities acting in combination to complete a comprehensive sewage scheme to handle the problems in a number of adjacent communities. As a result of this, the Surbiton Improvement Commissioners immediately applied for permission to form a joint sewage board. They proposed a scheme whereby the sewage of all the authorities from Windsor in the west to West London would be removed from the Thames and taken instead to an outfall near the sea below the central London outfall. Now, if this scheme sounds familiar, it was in fact devised by Joseph Bazalgette, who was combining his continuing role as chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works with a spot of highly lucrative consultancy work. After yet another lengthy and expensive hearing, the inquiry inspector turned down the proposed scheme as being too heroic. In its place, he recommended the adoption of a more modest scheme involving the 20 riparian communities on the stretch between Hampton and West London, and therefore including Hampton Wick. The Thames Conservancy had held off their legal actions whilst the Surbiton application was pending, but as soon as the result was known, they started proceedings to recover the penalties against several authorities, with their first port of call being little old Hampton Wick, with a summons for penalties amounting to £98,000, equivalent to £143 million in today's currency. Now, since the entire freehold value of Hampton Wick was little more than that sum, the Conservators would have had to seize and sell off most of the properties to meet the penalties due, while at the same time ousting the residents. And the unlikelihood of this ludicrous prospect ever coming to pass emboldened the Hampton Wick local board. Thomas James Nelson took up his pen and proposed to his colleagues between Hampton and the western boundary of the metropolis that they should implement the scheme as recommended at the recent inquiry. He was confident it would be approved, and to add weight to his proposal, Hampton Wick applied to purchase some land in Twickenham for the joint sewage works. Another lengthy inquiry was held on Hampton Wick's proposal. The proposal was supported by Surbiton, Teddington and Richmond. And because Richmond Town were in favour, so too were the authorities grouped into the Richmond Rural Sanitary Authority. Unsurprisingly, Twickenham opposed the scheme, partly because they were already well ahead with their own sewerage project, but also because they hated the idea of playing host to everybody else's body waste. Both Ham and Kingston were against, and again, Kingston Rural Sanitary Authority joined that protest. For completeness, Norbiton and East Molesey were undecided. Now, the idea of a joint scheme had certainly received a very mixed reaction, to say the least. Now, Twickenham were able to escape at the very last minute, but the scheme itself, despite that level of support and non-support, was approved. And the first meeting was held a couple of months later with, wouldn't you believe, Nelson himself in the chair. Because of the formation of the joint board, the remaining 15 authorities covered by the new sewage district were now no longer held individually accountable for their sewage outfall. And so we can thankfully fast forward several years as far as Hampton Wick itself is concerned. Nelson remained as chairman of the joint scheme until his death in February 1885, by which time the sewage district was itself in its death throes. Support for the scheme had ebbed away until only Hampton Wick and Surbiton were keen to continue. Kingston Town Council had been bitterly opposed to its existence, and their enforced inclusion in it from the outset, whilst Richmond became increasingly disillusioned. By 1885, both authorities were openly attempting to bring about the demise of the joint board via a dissolution bill promulgated in Parliament by Kingston Town Council. Opposition to that bill came from Hampton Wick and from the Surbiton Improvement Commissioners. And whilst the bill was in the House of Lords committee stage, urgent negotiations were taking place between the parties in a committee room at the Palace of Westminster. Finally, the opposition to their bill was withdrawn in return for a package of important concessions made by Kingston to Hampton Wick and Surbiton. With all the opposition withdrawn, the dissolution bill was won and received royal assent on the 20th of August 1885. So the Lower Thames Valley Main Sewage District ceased to exist after 8 years of effort and £30,000, that's 40 million in today's money, of fruitless taxpayers' expenditure. As far as Hampton Wick was concerned, the negotiations had been conducted by John Arthur Buckley, who was Nelson's replacement as chairman of the Hampton Wick Local Board, and who was himself the chief clerk at the Court of Chancery. So his long experience of encouraging and observing effective negotiations in that court obviously stood Hampton Wick in good stead. An opportunity was open to him and he took it with both hands. And here's the concession that he, if formally requested by Hampton Wick, Kingston agree to take and deal with the sewage of Hampton Wick on the same terms pro rata as their own. Surbiton was offered the same terms. And if we examine that deal, you'll see Hampton Wick was enjoying all the economies of scale from a scheme designed for more than 10 times their own population at a cost of just 6% of the overall scheme. And just as importantly, space for the treatment works no longer had to be found within the village boundary, a challenge that had defeated Hampton Wick for more than 20 years. A second piece of opportunism was about to present itself and would provide an easy connection across the river into the planned Kingston works. Some years previously, the London and South West Railway Company had presented a bill to Parliament seeking powers to create a new line from Kingston to Fulham. It went from Kingston to Wimbledon and then followed the line that is now used by the District Line from Wimbledon to Fulham. It was widely believed that this was purely an anti-competitive move and that the railway had no intention to build such a line. Nevertheless, when in early 1886 the company were formally seeking Parliament's permission to abandon the plans, they were forced to make concessions to those bodies that might otherwise oppose them. And in March 1886, the Hampton Wick local board negotiated an improved rail service along with the provision of both a waiting room on the down platform and a urinal on the up platform. But most importantly, the London and South West Railway undertook that, if requested, they would carry sewage pipes on the side of their bridge across the river to Kingston's sewage treatment works. So Hampton Wick had finally achieved its goal, which had been struggling on for 20 years. They had a place to process its sewage, and not only was it right on the doorstep, but a very convenient way of getting the sewage across was also in the bag. So what's not to like? You would have thought now that that was game over, but you would be wrong. At their meeting on the 1st of February 1886, the local board had appointed 6 members to a new drainage committee to make the necessary preliminary inquiries as to the most advantageous method of carrying out the public drainage of the parish. The subject of drainage thereafter disappeared from the radar until the first report of the committee was received and considered at a special meeting held almost 2 years later. The content and the conduct of the drainage committee meetings can only be guessed at, since no minutes were kept, never were kept for committee meetings, nor were the proceedings reported in the press. In fact, press reporters were excluded from committee meetings. We therefore have to read between the lines to get a real sense of the conflicts, the confrontations and the contortions that took place within the drainage committee during their 2 years of deliberation. What we know is that the 6 members of the drainage committee had met a total of 16 times over the 2 years. Also, they'd set up a subcommittee of 3 members specifically to report on sewering the district. The subcommittee had 8 sittings and had produced a fully costed scheme, but were at pains to stress that their recommendation referred merely to the collection of the sewage. So the only remaining issue was, how do we dispose of the sewage? Now, I know you'll be sitting there thinking, hang on, a deal's already been agreed with Kingston, so what's the problem? Well, it seems that committees sometimes have the capacity to tie themselves into knots, and this is what seems to have happened here. Why? Well, I can't be sure, but I have 2 theories that could possibly explain. Firstly, back in 1884, Nelson probably knew the poor state of his own health, and recognizing that none of the existing board members would be capable of delivering a sewage scheme to meet his own exacting standards, he had invited a 59-year-old Henry Parsons to join the board. It seemed like he was almost deliberately putting a cuckoo in the nest. Parsons was the surveyor to the London districts of Lambeth and Camberwell, and his external perspective and inside knowledge of the workings of the other authorities was clearly valued by Nelson. And as a member, and very soon as chairman of the Hampton Wick local board, Parsons adopted a very much hands-on authoritarian approach, similar to that of his sponsor, but perhaps without the benefit of class. Though not necessarily a popular colleague and chairman, Parsons nevertheless proved effective in getting things done and ultimately fulfilled Nelson's faith in him. However, I suspect his tendency to ruffle feathers would have slowed things down. My second possible reason for the length of time it took to get the agreement amongst the local board has to do with the choice of the site in relation to where the board members themselves lived. If you were a Kingston town councillor looking for a site for your sewage works, I suggest that the obvious choice would be this section of the town with few houses and right on the river for easy transportation of coal and other supplies and for ready disposal of the effluent. In the mid-1860s, when this Ordnance Survey map was published, the site was owned by the trustees of the underage 9th Earl of Dysart of Ham House fame, and the fields were let for grazing. The land at the water's edge actually consisted of 2 islands, which became known locally as the Corporation Eights. The whole site was bordered by the railway line and the gasworks, and there was little surrounding housing, at least not on the Kingston side. It just so happened that since the early 1700s, the Hampton Wick side of the river had been a premium location for some of the best housing in the village and home to several board members. Parsons, meanwhile, was one of the first residents of the newly created Vicarage Road. Now, Nelson and Barker had both died before the deal with Kingston was struck, but both Buckley and Corns held out for a different solution, even though the Kingston works were going to go ahead with or without Hampton Wick. When the report of the Drainage Committee was finally presented to a special meeting of the board on 30th of January 1888, all members were asked to sign it. And Buckley and Corns put themselves down as dissenters on the grounds that further time should be obtained until it can be ascertained whether some combination can be formed on our side of the river. Nevertheless, the report was adopted by the board and Parsons was charged with concluding the agreement with Kingston. The fallout from the special meeting was not long in coming. At the board meeting held on the 5th of March 1888, the clerk read letters of resignation from the 2 dissenters, both of whom expressed disapproval with the chairman's handling of affairs. And although the chairman was asked to write to both and ask them to reconsider, there must have been collective sense amongst the remaining board members that a logjam had finally been cleared. Meanwhile, Parsons managed to win some important concessions from the Kingston Town Council. The original intent had been to build the works right next to the river's edge, so as close to the Hampton Wick board boundary as it was possible to be. It was agreed that the building would be moved further back on the site. And as can be seen from this photo, the building was anyway quite squat. So by placing it further back and building 2 screening walls, as you can see here, Kingston was clearly doing its best to lessen the visual offence it was giving to the Hampton Wick side of the river. And anyway, as this photo of the opening ceremony shows, the foundations of the building were anyway set below the surface. And finally, Kingston revealed that they were working on a plan to convert the rest of the rather nondescript site into a pleasure garden. This they finished by around 1900, complete with a bandstand, which, although now it's a replica of the Victorian original, still bursts into life every summer Sunday afternoon. Parsons reported back to a special meeting on the 23rd of March on his negotiations. Concluded with this recommendation: "We could have desired better terms, but as there is no probability of obtaining them from Kingston, and as we are of the opinion that there is no other scheme which will offer equal advantages, we recommend to the board that an undertaking be given to sign and seal the agreement as soon as the local government board shall enable us to borrow the necessary capital." The recommendation was adopted unanimously. On his own initiative, Parsons' next move was an interesting one. He issued a circular to the ratepayers explaining the board's action on the drainage scheme. And it started, "As chairman of your local board of health, I take the somewhat unusual course of addressing you individually on the very important subject which has for the past 2 years been occupying the earnest consideration of the board. I mean the subject of the drainage of the parish." The rest of it contained an excellent resume of the choices faced by the board and the reasons for their various decisions. We don't have time for it now, but the whole of it is included in the book. It concluded with a resigned but realistic comment, which said, as a board, we strongly objected to Kingston authorities placing their sewage works on the banks of the river as likely to be prejudicial to the interests of both parishes, but we were powerless to prevent it. I mentioned that the Drainage Subcommittee had devised a scheme for the sewage network whose task was to collect the sewage of the parish and deliver it to a point on the Lower Teddington Road, where the number 3 is. That was the focus of the Hampton Wick sewage scheme, right by the railway bridge and ready to move the sewage across the river to 28 foot above the river on the railway bridge through an 8-inch cast iron pipe. And interestingly enough, there is still a remnant of that 8-inch pipe fixed to the railway bridge abutment on the Kingston side. Now, the design that they adopted was one of the first in the country to use the newly invented shown ejector. So let me just briefly explain its purpose and its operation. Now, a well-designed sewer system using gravitational system of transportation needs to be laid at a gradient that will allow the raw sewage to flow at sufficient velocity, and that's around a sort of slow walking pace. And at that velocity, it actually scours the pipe as it goes. And the system is said to be self-cleansing. The minimum requirement, gradient requirement for self-cleansing sewers is around 1 in 200. So, for example, a 1 mile long sewer, such as the one that was coming down from Hampton Court, would need to be at least 28 foot lower at its downhill end, or nearly twice the height of a double-decker bus. The sewer subcommittee had therefore recommended the use of shown ejectors. Now, the shown ejector uses compressed air to raise the sewage at certain points along the line so that the required gradient could be achieved, but not in one go, in a series of steps. And therefore, the trench depth could be significantly shallower. The subcommittee had further recommended that the inventor of these ejectors, one Isaac Schoen, should be appointed consulting engineer to the total scheme. And both recommendations were adopted by the board. So now you know why they exist, and this is what they look like. This is your first shown ejector. I know you'll be gagging to know how it works, but I'm afraid we haven't time. But it is in the book. So the original plan was that the compressed air for the ejectors should be generated at the Kingston Sewage Works and piped out along the sewer trenches. But the board decided that the ejectors should be capable of operating on a 24/7 basis under local control to cope with any heavy overnight rainstorms. And since the Kingston Sewage Works were shut down from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. daily, this meant that Hampton Wick needed its own pumping house, which was to be erected immediately behind the board's new offices in the High Street. And thanks to Paul Barnfield's wonderful photo, we can see what the pump house looked like shortly before it was demolished. Having the pump house would ensure that the sewers could be filled to their capacity of almost 18,000 gallons as an overnight holding system whilst the Kingston Sewage Works were closed. With this last tweak agreed, the formal application was made to the local government board for sanction to raise the £8,000 needed to implement the scheme. An inquiry was held on this application in June of 1888, but it was the following January before the permission was finally given. At last, the local board were in a position to invite tenders for the scheme that they'd devised over 12 months previously. Now, work began immediately, and the disruption they caused to regular life in Hampton Wick was on a massive scale. I mean, just look at the size of those spoil heaps. And this fabulous photograph from 1890 shows the main sewer being laid in the High Street. The park gates are visible in the distance and Bridge Street is on the left. So this is what it looks like nowadays. Back in Victorian times, you'll notice that health and safety was not exactly a feature of Victorian. And after all that disruption, it was all put back in place. And here we can see the trench filled in another part of the High Street, and the house connections are clearly visible to the main sewer. And when we look at that same section today, it's amazing how little has changed. The work was completed early in 1891. There was no official opening ceremony, but the Surrey Comet marked the event with an article in their 28th of February edition. They described the scheme in detail and ended up with some extravagant claims for the merits of the new scheme. So it's considered by experts to be one of the best and probably the best of its kind in the country. Now this brings me almost to the end of my story. But I said at the outset that I was amazed how much of the original scheme is still in existence. Without doubt, today's sewer network is based on the pipes laid in 1880. But the shown ejectors, or at least the chambers in which they were installed, also still exist. Here's number 1, which is opposite Lancaster Lodge on Hampton Court Road, and its companion, number 1A, is opposite the gates into the Royal Paddocks, a bit closer to Kingston Bridge. And number 2 is just opposite the entrance into Bushy Park by the Bennett Memorial. And number 3, and it was one time when I was walking along the road, there was no traffic around, and I heard this humming sound, and I wondered where the humming was coming from. So this is the inside of that chamber. And that was the thing that caused me to just put my hand on the pipe that goes across the railway bridge. And to my amazement, it was vibrating. It is still, not only is it attached to the bridge, as was agreed in 1884, but it still carries the Hampton Wick sewage over the river on its way to Kingston's new Hogs Mill treatment works. I'd be very happy to take questions.